Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of gray, for purple mountains' majesty above the fruited plains. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood. From sea to shining sea, oh beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood. From sea to shining sea, America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood. From sea to shining sea, from sea to shining sea.
Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon if you're here in California. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today on our conversation about how to weave anti-racist principles into your advocacy on gun violence prevention. So I'd like to start really quickly just introducing myself, and then I'm going to turn it over to our fantastic panel here. My name is Erica Rice. I'm a program manager with Brady. I reside here in Oakland, California, and I'll be moderating this panel this evening. And now I want to give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves. So I'm just going to call out your name, and folks are going to share their name is, their organization, affiliation, title, and then one thing they hope our audience will gain by participating in this discussion with us. So why don't we go ahead and turn it over to Kelly Sampson first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly, and I am Senior Counsel and Director of Racial Justice here at Brady. I think I already forgot the second question, so I'll loop over to the last one. One thing that I would love for everyone to take from this panel is just the ways that gun violence is intricately tied to racial justice, and how so many of the issues that we see impacting people in healthcare and the economy and all those other issues also come to bear on this one. What was the second question?
It was your affiliation, so you nailed it.
Great.
So why don't I pass it over to Maddie?
Hello, everybody. My name is Maddie Scott. I'm the founder of Healing for Our Families in Our Nation. Proud to be the California State President for Brady, United Against Gun Violence, and definitely proud to be chapter leader of San Francisco Mothers in Charge. I do this work because I love it. I want justice for our people. I want to go to graduations and not funerals. My son, it's been 22 years, 23 years, and his case remains unsolved, like thousands of you who are watching on this call today. And so we're in it to win it, not just for my son, but for all of our children. We want to stop the killing and start the healing. And the way we do that is in the voting booth and taking action and not sides.
Thank you. Alea?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alea Eastman. I am 19, a sophomore at Trinity Washington University. I am a founding member of Team Enough, as well as an executive council member and the administrator for Team Enough. And I'm also a co-founder of Concerned Citizens DC. And one thing that I want everybody to take home, specifically for white counterparts that might be watching this, is just to take this information back to the spaces that me and my fellow sisters on this call might not be in. That's probably my main thing that I would want people to take home. Thank you.
Thank you. Amber?
Hi, my name is Amber Goodwin. But before I talk about the work that I do, I actually wanted to just start off by saying the names of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, Mercy Mack, all the people who have been directly impacted by gun violence. Maddie, to your family and to your son, my heart goes out to the survivors. So I wanted to start off by thinking about the people and saying the names of people who have been directly impacted by the work that all of us do. So I work for the Community Justice Action Fund. I'm based here in Houston, and I like to say, kind of just to have a little bit of fun, I'm in the home of Beyonce and also Megan Thee Stallion, and so I represent both of them all the time. I think that what I would like to make sure that folks get out of the call tonight, is just a real understanding that the humanity that is involved with actually loving all Black people, and not just Black people who talk a certain way or are palpable to white people, but also that if you want to love all of us on this screen, you got to love all of our people as well. And so I'd love to make sure that we actually really get into what it means to really believe that Black lives matter.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Tatiana?
Hello, everyone. My name is Tatiana. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from Milwaukee, and I am the executive director of 50 Miles More, and also a former executive council member of Team Enough. And I hope everyone, on this call who's listening, just given the fact that I'm surrounded by some amazing Black women, that you go back and, to really listen to support Black women. That's what you take from this panel.
Thank you. So as all of y'all can see, we have a top-notch panel here, and they're eager to tackle a wide variety of issues to include the debate on whether or not we need more gun laws, and if so, which ones. And of course, we're going to be touching on the big sort of topic of the day, which is the growing movement around defund the police. But since it is September, and that is Suicide Awareness Month, we're going to start there. And so what I want to start by saying is we know that around 2/3 of suicide deaths annually are Black men. However, Indigenous people are the second most impacted demographic, and Black youth have the fastest growing rate of suicide nationally. So with that said, I'd like to start with Maddie. Because we know means matter, right? The way that people could potentially attempt a suicide, how do we share a lock up your gun message within Indigenous and Black communities, especially when quick and easy access to firearms feels like a necessity in the community where they live?
Yeah, this is quite an urgent and necessary action with the suicide rate among African Americans, now particularly youth. The suicide rate has increased. We know that there's already a multitude before gun violence even occurred amongst us. We already suffered mental health issues and racial disparities that impacted our families heavily, okay, from lack of jobs, lack of resources, facing discrimination on an everyday basis when you know you qualify for a job and then you're told you're not going to get it, or being discriminated like my father growing up in New Orleans in Jim Crow. When they would get their paychecks, he would have to come and pick us up before getting his paycheck because they knew that Black men would go cash their checks at the Jewish check cashing place because they couldn't go to banks because the bank would come up with some charge and take your money. And then you have to go get your kids to cash your check to get home. And then you're stopped by the police. You know, you stop by the police, they're drumming up some charge against you that you fit the description of somebody. I watched my dad get arrested, handcuffed, and laid on the ground. And that's what my activism started because I was a big mouth kid. And I told that cop, what you're doing is wrong. My dad didn't do anything. And then my dad looked up at me and said, gave me that eye look to be quiet, and I wouldn't shut up. But anyway, they took his wallet and looked for his ID, and then they took his money. They took his 2 weeks of pay, and they took it, and then they let him get up and uncuffed him, and went back to their car to make some excuse. Then they came back and said, "Oh, you're not the one." So I said, "Well, give my father back his money," you know. And my dad just yanked me, and he gave him back his wallet, and we went on home. But that was the first time that I seen police brutality against Black men, and it has not stopped. It has not stopped, and today we have to do something to combat the disparities and the racism that's in our nation, that's plaguing our families, that's causing suicide. So if your dad comes home upset, the whole family is upset. You know, now it's being spilled onto our children, generation after generation after generation. And now look where we are today. Suicide is very high. That was something you never heard of in the Black community. Even during those times, you never heard of that. But today it's quadruple. And so mental health, I encourage mental health services, mental health treatment. We have Westside Community Mental Health Services here in San Francisco under Dr. Mary Ann Jones, who's African Americans, because Black people need to go see Black folks who know about their problems, who are in this field, who can address their issues and help them to become stable. So that's my take on that. And I could say a lot more, but I would like to hear from the others. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. Are there others who'd like to touch on sort of what we're talking about today in terms of access and how to share that message in Black community?
Yeah, I would just add that I'm a survivor of suicide and have had close friends and family members die by suicide. And I think that that Maddie is spot on. And I also I'm 40, but I'm also still consider myself a kind of a loudmouth big kid still to this day. And so I absolutely kind of had the exact same traits growing up, and saw the trauma that Black people have in this country every single day. But I would say that very specifically, when we're talking about access to firearms, we're also talking about how we need to have culturally competent ways to talk about access that are not the same that it's going to be in suburban America. That doesn't mean that there needs to be kind of like placating to the Black community, but there do need to be people who are Black therapists who are talking to Black children, and there need to be Black adults who are talking to other Black adults, and people are really seeing the humanity and the lives that are being lost, and it needs to be comprehensive. And so we can't have like one person talking to a young person when they're in 3rd grade and then they don't talk to anybody until they're 20. And we work with a lot of people who don't have human connection for a lot of for many years. And so there's so many different challenges that we have in our communities. And so I think as long as we're talking about like, is it an ad campaign? Is it different things like that? I think the cultural competency is very important, as well as thinking about how we have wraparound services. So we're not just sending somebody home with like a smiley face as a kid that has like a sticker on them that tells them that they're okay, but they get the wraparound services if there's any risk factors that are exhibited. And also we're really making sure that there are fully funded resources. I'm not a young person anymore, but I'm sure that Tatiana and Alia can talk more about this, but I didn't know any services growing up at all that I could go to if I was having mental health concerns. And I did as a young person. I think we all do as Black people in America. And so I think that the comprehensiveness, and then really people have talking about the access in terms of the unique needs of the Black community, especially right now. We don't get to stop being Black. I love being Black, but like, it's not like I'm Black on Mondays and Wednesdays, and then like I get to take it off and not see the trauma that's happening every single day in our communities. So like really thinking about how unique the culture is, but also making sure that we're talking to ourselves as peers and not having people talk at us that don't understand our experiences, I think is really important, especially for young people.
just wanted to chime in on something you said about talking to each other as peers, especially as it relates to having gun access. And I think that's a key point. One thing to do is just talk about it. And I think with suicide in general across populations, there's a stigma associated with suicide and there's a stigma associated with mental health issues. But I think in our community in particular, there is this external, perception of who commits suicide. And so often we talk about the rural middle-aged white male or the young white male, and we don't necessarily talk about women and we don't talk about Black people. And inside our community, I know growing up, there was this, at least I can only speak for myself, but this sort of stoic posture around expressing your feelings or expressing troubles. And so I think one thing that you can do if there's someone in your life and they're expressing to you that they're going through trauma, or you just see that they're acting differently, it's okay to just talk about it and say, start a conversation with them, especially if they have a gun, especially if they have a weapon in their home. You can actually have that conversation with them and make it okay for them to not be okay. And I know that sounds cliche, but to really let people know that you see them and that if they are going through something, you're available, you're a resource. And I think just talking about it can have impacts, because so often there's this implicit notion that it doesn't happen to us, that we're tough, that we're strong. And that can allow someone to feel alone in their pain or feel like, well, I can't express this. And so I think as someone who's supporting someone, especially if they have a weapon, but even if they don't, just talking about it and asking people if they're okay, or saying, hey, I'm worried about you, can be a good way to sort of at least deal with someone who does have access to a weapon and start that conversation.
Yeah, and I would just like to talk quickly about my personal experience. Being a survivor of gun violence, surviving the Parkland shooting, we've seen in our community after the shooting, funds not being properly allocated towards mental health support. We saw money being put towards having several officers on campus being fully armed with the same weapon that we were attacked with, which was extremely uncomfortable. And instead of putting money towards actual proper mental health resources, they instead gave us a media center filled with grief counselors. And every time we would go to the media center, we had to talk to someone different. And it was very uncomfortable for us to share our traumas with someone different every time. And I think it's really important when we're talking about mental health that we recognize that we need to hold those people that make those decisions accountable to properly allocate those funds for students. Because we saw after the Parkland shooting, 2 of our classmates committed suicide, not even a year later, which one included a Black male. So just making sure that we're having this conversation about cities properly allocating funds towards mental health resources in schools, specifically for students, and putting emphasis on it for students of color, because those are the students that we know deal with so many trauma in and out of school.
Thank you, Alea. We had a question from the audience to just repeat the information I shared earlier. So just quickly, 2/3 of the suicide deaths annually are white men. Indigenous populations have the second highest rate of suicide deaths. That's 14 per 100,000 people. But Black youth in particular have the fastest growing rate of suicide attempts and suicide completions. So just to share that with the audience. And so as folks may or may not know, the suicide prevention space tends to be fairly white and primarily made up of clinicians and academics. This often means it uses more traditional methods for tackling mental health. A clinician using evidence-based intervention that focuses on individual behavior, right? And this is a model that often ignores the role of historical trauma, as some people have touched on, racism and discrimination. So from your vantage points, what are the opportunities and challenges of this more traditional approach?
I mean, I think one huge challenge of the traditional approach has to do with the clinicians themselves. And I think Maddie or Amber touched on how Black people need to talk to Black people, and we need to be able to talk to each other. And I know even in my own personal experiences, there's a dearth of Black clinicians in these spaces because of the historical legacies around discrimination, around access to go into these fields. And so there's a double bind, and there can be a real disadvantage if you're going to talk to a clinician about trauma that specifically has to deal with your identity, and they're not able to address that portion of your identity, because then it can be doubly alienating. Not to mention the issues around getting access in and of themselves. And we live in a country where it's easier to get a gun than to get an opportunity to sit down with a professional. So I think one huge issue is just the practice and the clinicians themselves.
And I like to chime in on that, because here in San Francisco, we're just finished a 3-year pilot. We just got refunded for Black to the Future with Westside Community Mental Health Services here in San Francisco, with Dr. Mary Ann Jones, who's African American, and who is her office services the majority of residents here who are African American that suffer from trauma. We are helping to pull down the stigma of mental health, because a lot of our folks, there's been a stigma associated with that. And so mental health is just as important as diabetes or high blood pressure. Matter of fact, it's associated with it because, you know, that's what happens with that. Your blood pressure increases, you get unhealthy, you know, we overeat, we drink, we do all these other things that's unhealthy that harms us on a greater scale. So now we are Black to the Future are seeing families and communities within San Francisco, and hope to be the pilot for the nation that will help our families to pull down the stigma. We're working with the faith communities and the school district to make sure that folks get the right services, to let them know that services are out there, you know, and to let our folks know there's no harm in seeing a therapist. When you cut your feet, you go to the doctor and he sews you up. Well, when you're not feeling well, you need to go to a therapist to talk to about your problems. And of course, you want that therapist to look like you, because you know that therapist will understand where you're coming from. So there is the Black Psychologists Association that's out there. There was a think tank that's been here for many years with Dr. Nathan Hare and his wife, Julia Hare, the late Julia Hare. They did a lot of phenomenal work here and across the nation. So the resources are there, and we're here to put the resources in people's hands. So if anybody needs help, please reach out to us. I have a niece who lost her life. She was very professional. You couldn't have told me a day that she would have done what she did. She was very depressed, and she leaped off the Golden Gate Bridge in 2011, you know, at the age of 24, devastated my family. So mental health is a serious disease, especially now with COVID. There's more guns in the house now than ever before. We're asking all mothers who have young teenagers or young transitional age youth in the home, even girlfriends that's living with guys, and you got a toddler in the house, you need to ask, do you have a gun? I need to know if you have a gun in the house. You need to ask that question. And if they do, is it safe, and is it locked up, and is it legal to have? Because you put yourself and your whole family at risk if that child finds that weapon, or if anything else should happen. So we want to save lives, okay? And talking about this is crucial. We have to come to the table and talk about this issue of mental health with our clergy, with our schools, with our communities. Thank you.
I would also just add really quickly that I think if we're talking about the alarming rates of Black youth and Black people dying by suicide, that we also have to talk about the alarming rates of Black trans people, Indigenous trans people dying by suicide, and how we're not meeting the needs of the most marginalized people in this country if we're not having conversations that are centered around the most marginalized people in this country. And those are people who are queer, people who are don't have access to resources because of a variety of different reasons. So I would say that one challenge, but I think it's an opportunity, is really thinking about how, and I think everybody on the panel could probably talk about this, but how are these statistics, or these like physicians and other people who are working together who have these like kind of maybe nice pedigrees, how are they actually meeting the needs of survivors and not just what a research study says they should be studying? I know for me, I'm sick of being studied. I'm sick of being researched, right? And so I think that there's a kind of a larger conversation about how are we researching, but also how are we including and meeting the needs of what we know is factual about what happens with guns in our community. And I will say one thing, and this will just be a theme that I will probably keep coming back to, is white people don't know more than Black people. They don't know better than us, but for the most of the history of this country, they've been telling us what to do. And so I think part of the challenge has also been that there's a lot of non-Black people and non-Indigenous people, Latinx people who are idealizing what our issues and our challenges are and making that into a practice or making that into what we just do, instead of just finding doctors that are Black or finding nurses or working with people like Maddie and saying, what do you need to be successful? What do we need to fund? And so I think part of the challenge is really to focus on really making sure that we're uplifting the people who are closest to the pain, and that is Black people, and that we're also making sure that they are leading the efforts, whether it is a research study or anything like that, about the issue of suicide in our community.
And I'm so sorry. I'll very quickly add, and I think this goes with like reimagining, what is safety and public safety. I don't trust calling the police to help my friends if they're having a mental health crisis. Tony Robinson in Madison was killed by police while he was having a mental health crisis. And so, I'm not going to call the police to go help my friend if they're feeling suicidal. And so really just in reimagining that, like, what does that look like? Because I don't feel safe, bringing a police into a home of a Black person who's suicidal or experienced some mental health crisis. So really think about that. I know later we'll talk about defunding the police, but like why also we need to be anti-racist while we're doing this work, especially talking about suicide prevention.
Thank you. I think that segues nicely into my question on what would all of you recommend our audience prioritize to advance racial equity in their suicide prevention work? Like, what should they be focusing on? What should they be thinking about? I know Amber touched on it briefly, but if other folks want to talk a little bit about what should folks be doing instead?
Could you repeat that, Erica?
Yes. So instead of maybe approaching suicide prevention in the more traditional ways that we've been doing it, a clinician who's probably not from the community, who's, learned in these practices that may not apply to Black and Indigenous community or queer communities, how can our audience support our efforts, the efforts that all of you are doing here and every day in the community?
One thing I would say is to, support organizations like Healing for Our Families in Our Nation, Mothers in Charge, Black to the Future, because we deal with these families every day on a day-to-day basis. We hold healing circles in our community with the parents and their children who've been impacted by violence. So we do the work daily, every day, and we're the least funded in the community. We have to fight for dollars, which is unfair. And we know the issues that surround depression and all of that with our young people. So, I mean, there's been times I even have to have talks here in my house on the Sunday with mothers and their children who are depressed, and then have that one-on-one discussion with them to get them to agree to go see a therapist, and that the therapist is going to help you. The therapist that is African American, you will not be overlooked. You will not be, dismissed and felt like you haven't been heard, like when you went to the other therapist. So we are building those relationships up and pulling down the stigma and the barriers that oftentimes prevent folks from seeking treatment. Seeking treatment is better than seeking other things that folks go to, and that's what we want to prevent. That's what we've done in our healing circles, prevented lots of mothers like me. When this first happened to me, I was devastated. I became addicted to pills and alcohol and things of that nature, and it wasn't until someone reached out to me and told me about friends and families of murder victims that I started getting the help that I needed. And also the church plays a major role in this, the African American church, because years ago, that's where you went. You went to the church for everything. The church was your resource. You went to talk to the pastors and the laymen of the church and the mothers of the church who helped you get on the right track. Today, we don't have that, and we need to build that back. That's culturally sound. That was some of the cultural things that we did. So cultural sensitivity training must be developed in every aspect from police to mental health to our school district across the board. We need cultural sensitivity training in every major aspect to help us rid us of this problem.
Thank you, Maddie. We have a question here, and I'll go ahead and pose it because it's a pretty non-complex one. But someone's asked if there are 1-800 numbers specifically for mental health services for different communities, so a person in crisis can speak to a professional that will understand the full issue. Are there any that y'all recommend?
I don't have like the references for the numbers on the top of my head, but I do know that there are crisis services that speak specifically to different populations. Like there are services for LGBTQ individuals. I actually don't know if there are services specifically for like Black women in particular, but I can definitely look that up and put it in the chat if I can find it.
Yes, and there are services at Westside Community Services, and also services here on the Black to the Future. So I will get those numbers and put them up on the screen for anyone that's out there that's seeking help for mental health services.
Thank you. I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about gun policy specifically. So most gun violence prevention organizations focus on creating new gun laws to combat gun violence. That's a pretty traditional way to tackle it. What have, in your opinion and your experiences, have been some of the unintended consequences of creating new gun policies or implementing current gun policies?
Well, I tell you, last year, Brady passed 15 bills, 15 common sense gun law bills. One, we're still waiting for Governor Newsom to sign AB 2847, was the micro-stamping bill, which will be able to trace that weapon that was used in a homicide or a crime. Right now, it's hard to trace. But with the micro stamping, that will help officers and the criminal law enforcement to follow up better and catch criminals on a quicker basis because of the micro stamping. So I want to thank everybody who called in this week and continue to call into Governor Newsom about signing the AB 2847 by Assembly Member David Chu. That's very important. But last year, one bill we passed, and that was that you had to be 21 years old to purchase a gun. That's why I love Brady and the work that Brady does. We are on the phone every Monday with legislative bills with a wonderful person, Amanda Wilcox, who helps us get these bills to our legislators and to put them out there and to share them with you all. But one bill that was very important to me, you had to be, I didn't know that you could be under 21 and go and purchase a gun. Well, you could, but now you can't, thanks to California. That bill got passed last year along with 14 others, that you now have to be 21 years old with a background check before you can get a gun. And so I'm really glad that bill was successful along with all the others.
So that's a great example of like when it works really well. What happens sometimes when maybe bills don't quite get implemented the way we envisioned them? I think Kelly, you were.
Yeah, I was gonna just say that I love that you started the panel framing it out about how can we align our work with anti-racism, because Dr. Kendi, who wrote a couple prominent books on this subject, but one of the things he says that I think about a lot is there's no such thing as a race neutral law. Like laws are either ushering in justice and equity or they're not. And I think one of the issues that has arisen in this area around passing laws to prevent gun violence is that we haven't always thought proactively around whether or not the law is going to both usher in a reduction in gun violence and bring in racial justice. Sometimes we've just stopped short of what is this going to do around guns and not thinking about the fact that we live in a society where we know that the criminal justice system is built and operated to intentionally target Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people. And so there are laws that in their application have allowed criminal justice system to just further target our communities, further arrest people, and further mass incarcerate. And that drains the community, which then can contribute to gun violence. And so I think one of the things that we have to be much more intentional about across the board with gun laws is really thinking, how is this gun law going to both meet our goal of reducing gun violence, but also what are the logical steps of how this law might be applied and what are the racial implications? So thinking about that up front to make sure that we're not simply giving a tool to continue to extract people from their communities.
Yeah, and I think a perfect example of that is the crime bill in 94. I wasn't even alive then, yet I see the impact that that had. Like the Violence Against Women Act, one doesn't include Indigenous women, but it actually led to incarceration and then increased incarceration in Black and Brown communities. And in my opinion, I don't know if this movement should keep celebrating that bill. I understand, the assault weapons ban was passed through that, but a lot of that, increased incarceration and actually increased the violence in our communities. So it's not something that we should, keep, celebrating and pushing for. We have to like reimagine what all these things look like.
Thank you. Amber?
I was just gonna say, I have a lot of examples, but I think that I'll just say very concretely that I think Tatiana, you did a great, like very specific on especially the Violence Against Women Act, but I would say even things like background checks. When HR 8 was passed last year or 2 years ago, my years are all messed up now, there was a specific part of somewhat of a rider that was added on that included ICE. And I'll go say very fervently that I think we should abolish ICE. And it added ICE as a part of a system that was going to be part of preventing gun violence, which was unnecessary and also something that would actually harm immigrants and harm Black people, because Black people are immigrants. And so it was unnecessary, but it was something that most people, a lot of people in the gun violence prevention movement who wanted this background check bill, wanted this bill to go through regardless of whose back it was on, right? So some organizations, including ours, said we won't support this unless it's a clean version that goes to the Senate, right? So that's one issue of let's just make sure that we aren't that we are actually doing no harm first. That should be our first thing that we think about. And I think to Kelly's point, there are so many pieces of legislation that on its face are really great, including domestic violence. But when we're talking about relinquishment of firearms, we're usually talking about law enforcement. When we're talking about ERPO, we're usually talking about law enforcement. Right now, I think every single day when I wake up about a Tatiana Jefferson and how ERPO would not have saved her life, right? She did everything she was supposed to. She had a lawful firearm and she still was shot and killed by the police. And the same thing with so many other people. And so we can't over rely not just on law enforcement, but also just these harmful systems that have been built on white supremacy to save us. Whenever it comes to legislation, we have to think more about who is actually being harmed first, and also having those people at the table. I wouldn't have known any of this stuff 6, 7 years ago before I got involved. And that's my own, that was on me to learn more. But now that we know this information, we have to do better. We can't go into another congressional session or any legislative session where there's anybody who's saying, hey, what about me? What about me? This is going to harm me. We know that these laws harm people. So we have to do better. And so I do think that it's not just law enforcement. There are some things that just criminalize our people and don't give them the ability to actually rehabilitate themselves or give them the funding to actually be able to become whole people that we should really think about as well.
Thank you. I think that it touches on something around like how gun policies are made. Everyone sort of talked about who's not in the room, who is in the room. In my experience working on the ground in communities, they often focus their efforts on supporting individuals and families who've been impacted by gun violence, which is such deeply important work, but a little less on policies or laws. And so sometimes it feels like they're separate, they're siloed. If this resonates for folks, how do we engage program people with policy people so that we get the kind of gun policies and laws that we think are going to be most effective without disenfranchising Black, Brown, and Indigenous people? How does that happen? What does that look like?
It looks like, Team Enough and all the young people that, have come forward, who are now engaged. We have to engage our communities. We have to engage our young people. We have to, pull down the barrier of age and all of that in our community. We have to bridge that gap between elders and youth, and bring everybody to the table and hear and listen at our young people. At the same time, our young people hear and listen at our elders when what they went through and all the challenges of the civil rights movements, John Lewis and others, and bring that whole agenda together and have that conversation with each other and plan strategies strategically that's going to emphasize and exercise a cultural plan.
Maddie, I think we lost your sound. We can't hear you. Is it just me? Okay.
I'm having some trouble.
Oh, there it is. There you go.
Okay, I apologize for that. We have been divided, the generation gap between elders and young people. We have to come to the table, as we did when I was young with the NAACP and other elders of the church. That's how I learned about civil rights. That's how I learned how to become an activist, by coming together in the community with our folks and being at that table, addressing these issues, addressing the voting and addressing the injustices that our communities continue to face. Until we come to the table and have an agenda and have a plan, it's going to continue.
I would also say that there's no reason why any group that Maddie works with shouldn't be completely fully funded. And so I think that there's also a power dynamic because mostly white-led organizations have been in power for a very long time. And so I do think that there's an honest conversation that shouldn't be burdened by Black people, but for mostly white organizational leaders, that the funding support, I'm an executive director and I have to raise the funds for the organization. And I don't know how many times it's very challenging to do as a Black woman in particular, but I can only imagine how challenging it is as a Black woman survivor. And so I think people just in the gun violence prevention, kind of the policy movement, there is a lot of platform removal of like people giving up their platforms, reallocating of resources, making sure that organizations who are doing the on the ground work are fully functioning. And I would say that for far too long, people who are policy folks, and I started working on the Hill 19 years ago, for far too long, people who are policy people believe that people who are on the ground doing the work need to learn about what need to come to them. The people who are on the ground, I bet you Maddie could run circles around any member of Congress or any US senator, right? Smarter than any of them. But she's got to learn how to be a policy person. They don't have to learn about the community, right? It's always on the community to learn everything about the policy. And then the people who are doing the policy never have to learn about the community. So I completely agree that we need to come together, but I also feel like there's been this kind of power dynamic of like, okay, we'll just go to the community, hear what you're saying, and then we'll go back home, versus being like, no, we're going to go to your meetings even whenever. There's nothing that I get out of this. You do not have to show up and say anything about my other organization. We're only going to support the work that you're doing, right? And so I think that we've got to figure out that dynamic, and it also needs to not burden the people and the survivors who are doing the work on the ground.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off of that really quick. Going to college here in DC, I get to like see firsthand how DC natives feel with everybody doing advocacy here in DC, and there being so many national GBP orgs here in DC that wouldn't dare go step east of the river where they deal with the brunt of gun violence. And we see the same issue with politicians. The Hill is downtown and they wouldn't dare step east of the river where majority of Black and brown people live, Ward 7 and Ward 8, where there's literally a food desert. There's no hospitals, and these are the people that are dealing with gun violence every day. And we just like Amber said, we expect them to come downtown, we expect them to come to these orgs when it's not accessible to them, and it's time to meet them where they are. And that's where we will see real change. That's where we will finally have a conversation and putting policy and grassroots work together.
Just wanted to chime in too we talked a lot about like what politicians should do. And I totally agree with everything you said. And as someone who works for an organization that's a white-led organization, I think one thing that people like me and other organizations should do is when we hear what people are saying in communities, and when we hear what people are saying, this is what I need, or this is what's important to me, and say that we're going to be an ally or an accomplice in that work, to then make that our priority and then stick to it. Because the story you told, Erica, about, or maybe it was Amber, I'm sorry, but about the rider and the bill. And I feel like sometimes in this movement in particular, we almost have this sort of, I don't know how to describe it, but this idea of like, we're not going to get anything, so we have to take the crumbs. And so even if there's something a little off or not quite great, we just have to take it because we can't get anything else. And I think what I've learned, especially this summer through the movements for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, is that we have the momentum and we have sort of the moral high ground. And so I think like not settling for things that will hurt people in the long run can be a really important way of being an ally when we do get opportunities for legislation to say, this is going to have this impact, and sticking to it, I think, and not settling for kind of what we can get, not settling for the scraps, but really kind of thinking broadly and thinking expansively around like what we could really have if we really stuck to our guns. I shouldn't use that word, but if we really stuck to our principles, because ultimately there are things that we can do, like not allowing for little riders to come in and hurt people, that will help us in the long run. So I think that's something from the organizational perspective, when we do hear people, when people do share their stories with us, to actually take those and hold them in our work.
Yeah, and as my grandmother always said, a closed mouth don't get fat. We got to make some noise. We got to make some noise, and we got to keep our voices heard. We got to have that agenda and not be unapologetically have that agenda that addresses what we need in our community, and that we will be at the table. We will be at the table. There will be people of color hired in the police department to work in our neighborhoods. There will be legislators and policymakers that look like us. We have to be at the table. That's the bottom line. And we have to prepare our community to do that, you know, and we're in it to win it. And together, that's the only way that we're going to do it. And so I'm grateful for this opportunity under Brady to be able to have this important panel as we move forward with the agenda of, you know, racial justice.
So actually, as we talk about policy and organizing, we can't ignore that people are primarily organizing right now in this moment around the defund the police movement. So just big question, how do we have a productive conversation about policy implementation while remaining honest about the challenges inherent in the institution of policing?
I talk to my son about this. We talk about this, the men in my family, we sit down and we talk, but we talk because they're men and they're the ones that's going to be mainly affected by this more than anyone. Because they're the black and brown men, particularly black men, are at the top of the list of more arrests by the police and also being murdered by the police. Police reform definitely has to take place in this nation. And I don't believe in that we should defund the police totally. I think we should have police officers to rotate on a basis, you know, monthly, bi-yearly, or yearly, aid and officers not having to deal with a sense of loyalty that develops with working with the same partner, which leads officers to protecting one another when something goes wrong. Officers knowing that they will be getting a new partner could assist in reporting officers who do not follow proper procedures or who engage in criminal activity. Second, officers have route beats. All cops should be obligated to work in all neighborhoods and communities. This would assist in officers not becoming jaded or from working in one particular community and feeling stuck, as I have heard police officers express, black and white. This could also aid in diversity training, culture sensitivity training, as well as training members of different communities being able to get to know and see different officers of all different ages, experience, and backgrounds, which could lead to more trust in policing in general. Some people have expressed being stuck or afraid of some bad cops that they may have to see or interact with on a regular basis. I believe that this could foster two-way street with more effective lines of open communication between officers and the communities they serve. We do not want to defund the police, but rather be able to trust the policing that's going on without fear of retribution. We could redirect those funds in strategic ways that would benefit both the police officers to do their job and the communities that they serve. And they have to be officers that look like us. They have to. And I think that once we get to that level, that will help us with community policing, because right now it's not like that. We know that.
So I'm personally, when I protest, we do at Concerned Citizens, we do talk about defunding the police. And we've noticed that people view that statement as this extremely radical idea. And it's not. It's simply just addressing the point of reallocating those funds to things that we know systematically benefit our communities, putting that money towards schools, our education system, towards food for these communities, hospitals, mental health, just give proper jobs. And we're not talking about jobs at like a McDonald's or Burger King, actual career-based jobs so people can actually have a proper life. We've seen that this system is actually doing its job. And as we continue to put flow of massive funds into this institution, we're just going to keep going down into the ground. We've seen, for example, I'm just going to say it, in DC, Mayor Browser will paint Black Lives Matter on a street and say, oh, we support Black Lives Matter, but this same street where we're occupying this space, we're being tear gassed and shot with rubber bullets. So we really need to have this conversation of reimagining public safety and coming from a community, Parkland, where there was no police department, and Parkland was classified one of the safest cities in the state of Florida before the shooting. We can actually have that conversation because we can see in communities that are given ample funds for schools, resources, hospitals, jobs, they don't have police departments. And we've seen that with Parkland, and it was deemed the safest city in the state of Florida. So I am absolutely for expanding the conversation of defunding the police and reallocating those funds towards things that we know benefit our communities systematically.
One thing I would add, oh, sorry. I was just gonna say to your question about like how to have the conversation. I don't know all who is on this call or where you're situated in society or where you're situated in the movement, but one thing I would say to have the conversation well is just basic human empathy. I feel like so often these conversations go sideways because someone will say, you know, defund the police, or this is what I'm going through. These are encounters I've had with police. And then people, and I'll just stop being abstract. Like, oftentimes a Black person will say, this has been my life experience. This is what I have been through. This is my life. And a white person who has not had the same experience with law enforcement will have a reaction based on, well, that's not true. That's not been my experience. That's not what I've been through. The police protected me, et cetera. And I think one thing that can help these conversations go smoothly in whatever organizations people in this call are in is to just have empathy when you see people, whether it's in a personal conversation or you're seeing a movement, understand that even if you're hearing things that you're unfamiliar with or that you don't think are true or don't match up with your lived experience, to at least think this is a person's, they're telling me their experience, or people are marching because this is their experience. Let me hear what they're saying. Let me at least understand. Let me dig in and research and listen. And I think an analogy would be if a friend tells you, oh my gosh, I'm having the worst day ever because X and Y situation happened at my job and I'm so upset. And even if for you, that may not be a situation that you understand, I think you can understand in an interpersonal dialogue why it's probably best to just say, that sounds hard. Can you tell me about that? Or, you know, that I want to know more. I want to support you rather than, I'll get over it. My job is great. And so I think empathy can really help these conversations go a long way, especially when we're talking across lines of race, because Black people do have a different experience with police in this country. I mean, I've quote unquote done everything right. And I've still had negative encounters and been profiled by law enforcement. So that's one thing I would just encourage people on this call to do in these conversations is just take a beat. If you're having a reaction, and just think about how to be a good listener or a good friend or a good colleague or whatever in the movement.
I would also say that I think that like multiple truth, we can like hold, as Black people, we've had to hold multiple truths, and a multiple truth that I hold right now is that I think the system of policing cannot be reformed in its current state, but at the same time, if someone broke into my house, you can't see my like dogs back here, they're not going to help me. So I don't actually know who I'm supposed to call besides 911 right now today, right? So I hold both of those truths right now of like that I don't struggle with, because I do believe that the system isn't working the way that I think we would imagine that it should. But at the same time, I think to everyone's point, it's like we've got to get to some place that is like working for the people who have been most marginalized in this country, but very specifically because policing was started to catch people who look like all of us, to catch slaves, to catch our ancestors. That is a system that is very challenging, that we have to over explain to people about why we're having challenges with it, right? That's been part of the problem. So Kelly, I'm so glad you and Manny and everybody brought it up, because part of the challenge is like, we just need to be listened to about why we would have a struggle in the first place, right? About why we're even having these conversations. And I love my girl, Jane Fonda, my girl, I don't actually know her, but she was talking on a TV show and somebody was like, I don't like the term defund the police. And she was like, you know what? I think we need to take our cues from the movement for Black lives. We've had a not long enough time to talk about this. And I think she meant just broader, we need to take our cues from the Black community. We need to take our cues from the Black folks that are struggling with this. We need to take the cues from people who are like, I jokingly say all the time that like, I did buy like a Peloton and a bread maker at the beginning. I went from like baking bread to like complete anarchy at the end. Like by like August, I was like in the streets doing stuff, but at the beginning I was just baking bread of COVID. So a lot of people, you know, you asked me a year ago, I would have had a very different response to what I say right now about the system. But I do think, just to put a fine point on this, it's the system that I think we need to have a larger conversation of, because the system is actually working the exact way that the system of policing in this country is supposed to work. It is. And that means that more Black people, Black men, are going to be more disproportionately profiled. It means so many different things for Black women. It means so many different things for trans people in this country. And I will tell you that there are so many data points that will say investing in our communities, giving money to community-led organizations, understanding what communities need, you know, doing things like Eric, I know you all have done in Oakland around community-based programs. That has the efficacy and the research to say that this actually saves lives. That has the research to say that it helps communities, that it brings funding to communities. Policing does not have that same efficacy. It does not have that same result. We do not have data that says if we over police communities, it will make our community safer. So my response back to people is just like, which one do we choose? Do we put millions of dollars into investing into our communities, or do we keep funneling more money into something that we don't know in its current slate doesn't work? And so that's kind of like what I don't struggle with, but like how I have this conversation, because I think as we talk specifically about gun violence, there's a huge conversation that needs to happen about how if we're taking money away from policing, we have got to be very surgical and very specific that the investments have got to go to save lives from gun violence. And it has to happen with being led by the community and led by Black folks in all municipalities, states across the country.
Yeah, I'll just say, you know, both my parents are Black and police officers. However, 50 Miles More, we are an abolitionist organization. We support police abolition, we support prison abolition. And that's because we really believe that you can't reform a system that is inherently anti-Black and inherently anti-Indigenous. So when we talk about defunding the police, that is a simple step towards abolition, but that is not full abolition of policing as we know it. Of course, I love my parents, and I think when we talk about, good cops and bad cops, it's the system of policing that needs to go. My parents and a lot of folks that I know that work in the city of Milwaukee as police officers are good people. However, Dontre Hamilton in Milwaukee was still killed, and there's just so many examples of this. And I think we started having abolition teach-ins, and we just talked with youth like, what does the world look like without police? And really just having these discussions as a community. It has to be a community discussion on what does public safety look like. I personally don't believe that this is where it goes. Policing is not it. And really, is again, we have to reimagine our society and our culture, and that takes a lot to think beyond the world of prisons, beyond the world of policing to keep us safe.
Thank you. So one question I just sort of been grappling with personally, and I'll pose it here. When it comes to policing and police reform, what are some of the beliefs that people have to be willing to let go? Like, what are the things they've got to be willing to give up for us to make real progress in this movement? I think about this a lot when we talk about when we talk about white privilege, and we talk about a variety of privileges, whether that's ableism or, so on and so forth, like having citizenship privilege, right? What do people have to be willing to say, this is my belief system, but I might have to let some of these things go if I want to be able to support the greater good?
I think one thing, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, you can go.
I was just going to refer to something you said, actually, Tatiana, which is that both of your parents, you love them and they're good people, but you still are thinking about the system. And I think when we talk about police reform, one thing that I think we have to give up is this idea that good people cannot be caught up in systems that are leading to bad outcomes. And I think in this conversation, so often people will say like, but this is a good person, or I know a good cop. And it's like, we're talking about a system. And so when we're thinking about systems, you have to kind of give up this belief or idea that individuals can therefore validate the entirety, but really be willing to think holistically and think systematically. So that's one thing I would say.
The only thing that I would say is unlearning like who is a criminal, like what is crime, because that's really white supremacy being upheld, and white supremacy has really determined what that is. I also want to go back to Kelly's point. Without a doubt, my parents have definitely helped people, Black people in our community, and have saved lives. However, that doesn't automatically mean the system's working, the system's good. So we just again, we just have to really talk about this as a community and like unlearn and rethink these things that we've been really brainwashed to think.
I would say on the same thing, I completely agree. And then I think, that Black people who have done something bad are possibly worth killing. Right. So like every time there's somebody who's Black who's been shot and killed, it's like, okay, let's dig right into what they've done. And I tell people all the time, like, if I don't care if my friend had like something dramatic had happened, like there was no reason for him to be shot and killed and his body lay on the street for hours, right? Our humanity is stripped around. So I always tell people all the time that part of getting to that theory of abolition that is also based in love and support. And one of the reasons why America has not burned down yet is because we fundamentally believe and value the land that we're on, and we fundamentally believe and value the lives of other people, is really thinking about how we also don't have to have a perfect crime victim as well, because that's a lot what happens with our people whenever it's with policing. It's like, oh, he did this, or she did this, or did she have a gun? And it's like, well, that's not what happens. Shouldn't happen to anybody. It shouldn't happen to white people. Shouldn't happen to Indigenous people. And so I think really thinking about that. And then I think a big one, especially for not just the gun violence prevention community, but just people in general, is thinking that policy is going to solve everything, because it's not. Right? We have to shift culture. We have to shift how we think and reimagine, but also refocus our resources. So, we can have the conversations that Maddie and everybody was talking about, where people are coming together, but like our nucleus and our North Star isn't just passing one bill, because that one bill could get passed and we can still be living in poverty and we can still be getting shot in the street, right? And so like, how are we thinking about comprehensively changing the material conditions that are making it really hard to continue to survive and be Black in this country. And so I think that's part of the process, is also rethinking, like, what does a win actually look like? You know, we want to have policy wins, but like, wouldn't it be great if like there was full funding for so many different community-based organizations across the state of Texas or California or North Carolina, wherever it is, and that those folks had the seat at the table, that survivors were leading things. So I think there's a lot of other nuanced ways that we can rethink and, you know, kind of, it's hard being policy people, but to reimagine what it is that like success looks like, because it doesn't look the same depending on where you live or where you are.
And I want to say, being at the table is very important and crucial, that we show up and be at the table, demand a seat. I sit on the African American Police Advisory Board, the Chiefs of Police African American Advisory Board here in San Francisco, under Chief Scott. I was appointed by Police Chief Greg Sura prior to that in the Police Commission. And we have to be at the table to tell them what we and how we feel about how they police our community. You know, that the things that they're doing, the profiling, the racial profiling. I remember that bill, we did that here in San Francisco under Supervisor Malia Cohen for District 10, because this.
I think we lost your sound again, Maddie. No.
Okay, you still can't hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. What I was saying was Supervisor Malia Cohen in District 10. My apologies, I hit the mute button accidentally. Anyway, District 10 was the highest number where racial profiling was going on. We took those statistics and we put the data together. We had a rally on the steps of City Hall to pull down that and to say enough is enough. So we have to show up at the table. We have to show up at the police commissioners meetings that's held on Wednesdays. We've asked them to change that date to another day, because Wednesdays most Black folks are in church at Bible study. So we've asked them to do that. So those are the kind of things that we have to do to get on that board and to say what we want, how we want our communities to be policed, how we want officers to walk the beat, not be in their cars streaming down the neighborhood 50 miles an hour, you know, with a siren on, about to kill somebody. We don't want that, you know. And I must say that under Chief Scott, we have done some improvements here in San Francisco, and we are continuing to do more improvements by being at the table, having our youth at those police meetings that are held, and demand that there be a community police meeting in your neighborhood every month at the precinct that polices your community. That's what you have to do. And then you have to tell them what you want. You have to, you know, do surveys on how many people in your neighborhood have been profiled. You know, we know domestic violence situations. Oftentimes people don't call the police because they're afraid that the police is going to come and shoot the individual, like what happened in Vallejo, you know. So there's a lot of things that we have to do to address these issues, but we must be at the table. We must demand that there be more people of color in those uniforms that look like us. We must demand that those people that's policing our communities are from our communities, and encourage our young people who wants a career in law enforcement. Hey, you may consider one to being a peace officer to come back here and police your community, which we have several police officers here that do that. So I know it varies all over the country, but that's what we're doing here in San Francisco with community policing. It's very important and very crucial that we be at the table and to have our list ready of what we want. Thank you.
Thank you. I imagine we could probably put together a little proposal right now on what we would imagine as a new type of enforcement policy that doesn't look like our current one. But I do want to move to the questions where I think we can answer some of those things. So one of the first questions that we have is, I think harkening back to the sort of policy conversation we were having, how do we get legislators to be in partnership with the nonprofit organizations who are doing this work? I know y'all touched on that briefly, but are there specific things that we could do to make that happen?
We make phone calls. We address that legislator with letters. You know, like we do with Brady. We want something passed. We send a mass text out for folks to contact your legislator on this particular issue or this particular bill. You know, use social media. Social media is wonderful. Have a rally, call a rally and get everybody together to have a you know, press conference with that legislator, letting them know that this is what we want, and let everyone see that your voice is, what you're talking about is important, and that you want your voice heard, and so that everybody would know that you have already addressed that legislator. If he or she doesn't do what they're supposed to do, then there's next steps.
Awesome. The next question is, what do you think of ceasefire type programs with call-ins and help for people likely to be involved in gun violence and getting a job, etc.? Anyone have any thoughts?
I think that, ceasefire is obviously effective if you look at the data, but it's also challenging in terms of the levers that are the first ones that are pulled are normally law enforcement. And so I would just, for anyone who asked it, I would also just broaden kind of what our thinking is on how the strategies that many of us have studied for years, a lot of them have evolved. So there are things like cure violence, there are hospital-based intervention, there are things like advanced peace. But then I know that there's amazing community groups on the ground that maybe don't have a catchy name, but are actually doing the intervention work that is really incredible. And so I know that like the DC Office of Neighborhood Safety does incredible work that is really based off of the neighborhood safety model that was in Richmond, California, but also in Stockton and in a couple of, it's now starting in Fresno, that is focused more on what we've all been saying, which is what are the resources that people need that are at the most risk of possibly being that small percentage of people who are committing the most crimes. And instead of incarcerating them, giving them a job, giving them housing, giving them a place to work and different things like that. And so there's a lot of investment strategies, but I think a lot of folks are moving away from that first lever that's being pulled being law enforcement, even though it is effective in terms of crime reduction, but it is, there are some challenges in terms of the amount of harm that it's caused and the pipeline to mass incarceration as well.
Thank you. See if anybody else unmuted. Next question we have is, I always hear about de-escalation training, but don't the police need non-escalation training? When I see the videos of police interaction, they seem to be the ones who escalate the problems. It's just a statement of fact, but does anyone have additional thoughts about de-escalation training, its effectiveness, its lack of effectiveness?
Yes, we did de-escalation training here under I forget his name when he was the assistant chief. Well, he was the acting chief at the time. I can't call his name right now, but anyway, we had a situation of a young man who had saw the person who had taken his brother's life, and it disturbed him, and to the point where he happened to have a weapon on him, and he was afraid. He carried that weapon out of fear, and when he saw the young man, it just brought him back to that place, and he was about to take his life. And it was downtown San Francisco on 7th and Market. I'll never forget it. And the mother contacted us, and she said, "Oh my God, Maddie, we don't know what to do. My son is down there, and he's freaked out." And I said, "Let me call let me call the chief and see what we can do to assist him." And so I said, "Is there anybody in your family that he could talk to that would talk him out of that?" She said, "Yeah, my nephew." And so the nephew got on the phone. I contacted the chief, the assistant chief at that time, and he, because of us having this conversation prior to this happening, we had been having this conversation because of the recent officer-involved shootings regarding mental health, and because of that training and those meetings that we had, the officers were all able to hold off, not even draw their weapons, talk to that young man, let his cousin call him and talk to him to actually talk him out of it. It took about almost 2 hours because it was a 2-hour confrontation thing on the on 2 hour on the scene. And because of that one gesture, and because of that training, a life was saved. No one was shot. The officers were all relieved. He was able to get the treatment that he needed. Why? Because we had a de-escalation training for SFPD officers at that time. They implemented that. And so I think that needs to be put in place, not only for mental health, but also when addressing gun violence, you know, where
We lost your sound again, Maddie. Yeah, I think we've lost your sound.
yeah, that's okay. That's okay. As I was saying, the gun violence restraining order, we're working on that with Brady, and hopefully that will get implemented nationwide. But policies like that is going to help the crisis of when officers have to go out to apprehend someone who's mentally ill, may have a knife wavering, you know, like the Mario Woods shooting that happened. That shouldn't have happened. That shouldn't have happened if they had that in place. So it needs to be across the board in our police academy, mental health training, and cultural sensitivity training, all of those things. That's why the rotation of police officers is so crucial, so important in our community. If they do this, they'll become more acquainted with the people that they're serving and different populations. They won't just be with that one person and feel loyal to that individual. By rotating them across the board, it's going to help them become better officers, more informed, better educated about the communities and the people that they serve.
That is a optimistic viewpoint. I actually want to ask this question, Kelly, and I think you're would be a great person to answer this next one. There is a theory that urban gun violence is the product of racist policing, which leaves too many shootings unsolved. That without a reliable criminal justice system, some neighborhoods have no choice but to implement their own system of justice. Does this theory have legs? If so, how does it inform our understanding of the defund movement?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that theory, and I can't remember the name of the book. I think it was, oh gosh, I think Joe Levy wrote a book about this, and I can't remember the name of it. But the whole idea is basically that because there are neighborhoods where the police don't really effectively close any cases, that people now living in those communities know that in order to get any justice or safety, they should just take matters into their own hands. And I don't know the methodology that she used for that study, so I won't try to go there in terms of whether or not there's merit to it, other than say that lines up to experiences that I've seen where there are communities where the closure rates for Black victims in Black communities are very low. Where I'll pivot to, because I think I have more legs to stand on, is how does that relate to the conversation around defunding or revolutionizing policing? And I think it fits squarely within it, because it's just another way of showing that at least the current models that we're using don't work even on the police's own terms. I mean, if you listen to what officers and departments will say, they'll say, we're here for public safety, we're here to prevent crime, we're here to, investigate. And I think when you look at communities where you can know that there is not only very little chance that the police will be able to effectively prevent crime from happening in your community, but then if crime happens to you, you have very little recourse. I think that just goes to show that we need to think much differently and reimagine what public safety can look like, and start investing resources in programs that we know do deter crime, in programs that we know do keep people safe, like some of these community-based programs where people are actually having success around reducing crime. So there is a theory on that. I do think it's true. Like the closure rates are factually reduced in some communities. And I will look up the name of that book. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Is it Ghetto Side by Jill?
Yes.
When someone posted it. So. Fantastic. I was just looking through, see if we have any major questions left to answer. One good question that I've heard people bring up, and then I know we got to close out soon. Do all police need to be armed in all situations? Does anyone know if any police departments have unarmed officers in some situations?
Probably not in America. But I've gone travel to other countries and seen lots of law enforcement, and they don't have guns. And it was actually shocking to not see a police officer with a gun, which tells kind of the story of how, America is. And that I was shocked that somebody wasn't armed, just because of the uniform that they were wearing. I'm sure there are maybe smaller places, but I can't think of any. I think somebody would have used this as an example at some point. So I think we would know, but I don't know any offhand. There may be some municipalities that are.
One thing I would raise is, I don't know about police departments that have been unarmed, but I was really struck by, there's a group in DC called the Alliance of Concerned Men and Women, and Clayton Rosenberg, who works for them, has become a friend of Brady and has talked to us numerous times about the work that he's doing. And I was really struck by the fact that he and his colleagues, they're a group of violence interrupters, but they do so much in their community. They, even during COVID, have been giving people food, and really working to do a lot of the work that we talked about, which is thinking holistically about public safety. And they don't have any weapons, they don't have a badge. They have some jackets with their logo on it. And so they go into some of the areas of DC that are most impacted by crime, and they just go in, and he says, we go in armed with our spirit, and we go in armed with love for people. And they're successful because they actually know their community, because they actually have trust in their community. So obviously they're not a police department, but I think their experiences and some of the stories that he shared have kind of shown me that this being embedded in a community, actually building those relationships and going in, have gotten to the point where now sometimes people will call them before they will call the police because they feel more confident. So I would be curious about other departments or police departments, but I was very struck by the work that they're doing. And I know that they're not alone. There are a lot of groups like them doing that work unarmed.
Yes, and here we that's similar to the Guardian Angels that we used to have, which was a great high school program here in San Francisco, where young people who were aspiring to become a police officer or join law enforcement, they were Guardian Angels. They would wear uniforms that they picked out, and they had red berets and red tapestry on their, and on their clothing, and they would actually engage in, situations in the community that would kind of, bridge the gap between any heated discussions or pull down anything that would happen. Also, we have the street violence intervention team here, SVIP. I hope I'm saying it right. Anyway, they're under the Department of Public Health, and they show up every time there's a homicide with Lynn Westry and all of the Department of Public Health team, which is a great program here in San Francisco. They're first responders, and they show up every time there's a homicide, no matter where it is. That team will show up and help to assess the situation, make sure that the crowd is contained. And these are people who are was former youth that had trouble. It was a job created for them because why? They knew the neighborhoods. They're a diverse group of individuals. They're young, and they're people from the community that used to be former this or former that. And that has now become a job. And so that is one of the areas that you could take some of the services from the police to create opportunities for organizations and young men to develop a training program like that in your cities to help with community policing. They do a very great job, and they show up at all the funerals, if especially if it was a homicide, to contain that crowd and to keep everybody safe. And they're there to bridge the gap between police and the community. And we have meetings every month, and it's a great program. But I think some of the funding that we could have, like Alea was saying, to take away from the police can go into the development of programs and jobs like that to help our people so that we can have better community policing and provide jobs and income for folks that normally would not have it due to their past history or whatever, but it is definitely something that needs to be addressed nationwide. And I know about the interrupters, so I'm glad you brought the interrupters up. That's a great program.
I think that's a great note for us to sort of wrap up on. I just want to do a quick recap of things that our audience can do in the coming days and weeks to sort of implement some of these solutions that we've offered. We would love folks to be investing in community-based organizations that are led by people of color. So whether that's volunteering your time, offering up money, doing calls on their behalf, whatever you need to do, really invest and support those organizations, challenging your own beliefs and what you're holding on to, and really listening to the experiences of people of color with lived experience. And also, a little shameless plug here. Brady and March for Our Lives have teamed up on a campaign, Voting Access Saves Lives, to really get marginalized folks, Black, Indigenous, Brown folks, people who've traditionally not shown up to the polls, to really engage around our election this year. So please head on over to learn more about our Voting Access Saves Lives. Sign up to be a democracy organizer. Sign up with so many organizations are doing this work right now. So please engage with those processes and really support those efforts. I just want to thank our panel so much. Y'all are so amazing. I know that people have got to go.
Can I say something before I go?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, sorry. I just want to thank Brady for doing this. I know it's not easy. I think that I don't believe in safe spaces. I believe in brave spaces. So I think that you all have done something that a lot of other white-led organizations are not doing. And so I just want to thank you all for bringing this together. I just want to shout, I don't know if he's still on, but I know Christian, who's been an incredible advocate and also an ally for a lot of us, is also on, as well as Delphine and all the survivors who are on. I just want you all to know that I know we talked about it a lot today, but all of our work as an organization and all the people that you heard from is centered on the voices of survivors and Black people and people who are marginalized. And so I just don't want that to get lost in what anybody thinks about what the next steps are. And I'm going to make a plug also. Maddie, what is the name of your organization?
Healing for Our Families in Our Nation.
What is the website? You have a website?
HealingForYou.org.
Everyone should go there and make a donation. CJF is going to make a donation to your organization tonight. Tatiana, what's the name of your organization? 50 Miles More. What's the website?
50milesmore.org.
Okay, that was easy. Everyone should go to these two Black women who are doing incredible work and donate to their organization. You can do it. It is going to be helpful all year round. Become monthly donors, weekly donors, whatever you can do. We need to support Black women and we need to do it with our dollars. And so please make sure that you're supporting the people that you heard from today. Sorry, just had to say that.
Oh, please. Thank you. Thank you.
I plug really quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Please follow Concerned Citizens DC on Instagram at Concerned Citizens DC and on Twitter at Concerned of DC. We're doing a lot of work on the grounds here in DC, including a lot of work in Ward 7 and 8, making sure that we're feeding those communities and being resources to those communities that are heavily impacted by gun violence. And you can find ways how to donate to us on our Instagram. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. We should share out those links when this goes live. But thank y'all so much for being here, to all of our fantastic panelists. Thank you, audience, the 67 of you who stuck with us. Have a really wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.